Okay, thank you, Richard. Thank you to Teresa as well, both of you for organising the conference. And thank you for inviting me here to share my own work with what I'm hoping will be a sympathetic audience. I'm delighted to be able to share this new project with you, and I'm hoping it will generate some interesting discussion, and more selfishly, I'm hoping I can get some useful feedback on it from the collective expertise in the room. Today is the 15th of October, which by a wonderful coincidence for me would have been Nietzsche's birthday, specifically his 67th birthday. So I think it's quite auspicious for the conference as a whole, but it's nice because Nietzsche and birthdays are both going to feature in what I'm talking about in a moment. So here's what I'd like to do this evening. There are basically three sections to my talk. First, under the heading, The Root of Our Discontent, I want to just outline a particular problem I've got with the human-animal binary that's the subject, or part of the subject of the conference title. In the second part, entitled Werde der Beast, this is Becoming What You Are in Nietzsche's philosophy. I want to outline this just very briefly, and outline what Nietzsche means by this notion of becoming what we are, which I hope is a way of approaching this thing I have a problem with. And then in the third section, racily titled Lineages, Colours and Cunnilingus, I'm going to look at three alternative forms or ways of approaching the human-animal binary and complicating that a little bit. That's the racy material for the evening. I'll warn you now, there are illustrations in that section. And then just at the very end, it's already a section in its own right, but I've just got a paragraph just to wind up and pull things together. Okay, so here we all are. I'd like to open with Sartre's account of bad faith. Sartre suggests, in Being and Nothingness, that one of the ways in which human beings cope with the burden of freedom is by means of a practice or project of bad faith. Faced with the unbearable prospect of absolute existential freedom, human beings adopt an identity that they intend to fully define and delineate them. They seek to escape this uncomfortable situation by denying their freedom and seeking to act and behave only as this particular role or identity dictates. As some of you may know, Sartre's famous example of this is the cafe waiter. The waiter throws himself into his profession, into his role, and he's overly attentive to his customers. His behaviour is sort of almost mechanically perfect. He becomes the archetypal waiter. And in fact, he identifies so fully with the role of waiter that he effectively becomes almost like an automaton, something with no freedom at all. So he denies to himself all the other possible ways of acting and behaving, of identifying and being. Nonetheless, Sartre suggests the waiter knows deep down that this identification is effectively a willful over-identification. The role of the waiter does not fully define and delineate him, and he doesn't have to act in this way. He is, of course, far more than just a waiter. And it's the duplicitous, self-deceptive nature of the identification here which makes this bad faith. The individual knows but refuses to acknowledge to himself that he's more than just a waiter. So the notion, or the element of Sartre's notion of bad faith I'd like to take up is this idea of living without acknowledging to yourself that the identity to which you're holding fast is just one of a potentially infinite number. And appropriating Sartre's understanding, the root of my discontent today is a particular form of this bad faith. Specifically, it's this persistent self-identification in a whole range of writers, academic, activist, and otherwise, and by means of a particular rhetorical strategy, which I'm going to mention in a moment, as preeminently or exclusively human. And I provide two examples by way of illustration, one of which is openly opposed to any kind of critical animal study sensibility, and one which is openly supportive. I could have chosen many other examples, but I've settled on these two today. So my first example comes from an essay by the legal scholar Richard Epstein, entitled Animals and Objects or Subjects of Rights. Some of you may have come across this essay. As a whole, it's a critique of the very notion of extending rights to animals, largely on the basis that human civilization, Epstein suggests, has consistently, despite its many varied forms, depended on what he calls the domestication of animals. And I don't want to go into the details of Epstein's argument, which makes for quite depressing reading, but to focus on the closing sentences and the particular form of self-identification that he chooses to make in this essay, as exemplified in these final sentences. Epstein says, "The root of our discontent In the end, we have to separate ourselves from the rest of nature from which we evolved. And happily but consistently, the collective we is prepared to do just that. Such is our lot and perhaps our desire as human beings. So you'll notice there's absolutely no question that it is as a human being that Epstein identifies himself here. And despite the explicit identification towards the end of that passage, you'll notice there's numerous plural personal pronouns in this, lots of we's, lots of ours, lots of ourselves. And this is that rhetorical strategy I mentioned in which I'm interested. Epstein self-identifies as human, and he consistently marks this self-identification by means of the personal pronoun we. Okay, so that's my first example, Epstein. For my second example, I want to look at a passage from Mark Rowland's book, Animals Like Us, which is an explicit defence of the notion of animal rights. And the passage in which I'm interested, I could have chosen many others from the book, comes from the first chapter. Rowlands is examining the question of whether animals can suffer or feel pain, and he says, contrary to the Cartesian philosophers that he's been discussing, now, however, we are in possession of so much evidence that emphasises just how similar we are to other animals. In particular, we know that we have all had a common evolutionary history, beginning with the chains of molecules floating around in the primeval soup. Now, Rowland's sympathies are unquestionably different from Epstein's, and the we here, but the we here, at least in the opening passage, is still assumed to be human, despite the fact that in direct contrast to Epstein, Rowland emphasises a human-animal continuum, plural personal pronoun, for instance, in just how similar we are to other animals, refers to the human we. Both writers take we humans as their starting point. The rhetoric is the same in this regard and serves to instate, I suggest, a binary, if you like, between humans and other animals, irrespective of their very different agendas with regard to animal rights. So these are two examples of self-identification as human, and I just pause momentarily here to make a request of you. Is this particular rhetoric I'm interested in this new project, this employment of we and us as a presumed common humanity? And I'm collecting interesting examples of this from all different discourses and texts, so if you come across these, please do email them to me. It's my first plea for the evening for your common benefit of your common expertise. Now, this kind of self-identification as human is most often done unreflectively and on their explicit basis. It's not quite clear, I think, what is meant by this human we, other than that it is a human we. It's so obvious in these texts, so normal even, that it seems not to need spelling out. We might call it for this reason a kind of anthroponormative self-identification. But I'd like to try and spell it out, to make it explicit what this common human we is the writers so often identify with. The term human here, in this particular context, is far more than just the biological species Homo sapiens. Ideologically and historically, the term human is far more loaded than just that natural category, even if it does invoke or draw on the scientific connotations, the authoritative scientific connotations of it as a natural category. And I think what writers very often have in mind here, or have in the back of their minds, if it's not explicit, is a kind of ahistorical, transcultural human we. And it's this kind of ahistorical, transcultural human we, I think, is perfectly encapsulated in a particular photographic exhibition, which I'd like to use to illustrate this particular conception of humanity. So The Family of Man, some of you may have come across it before, was a photographic exhibition curated by Edward Steichen, first shown in 1955 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it comprised just over 500 photographs taken from numerous countries. As an exhibition, it toured all around the world, it's turned into a book which you can still buy by the same name. And Steichen says in his introduction to the exhibition and the book that the exhibition was conceived as a mirror of the universal elements and emotions in the everydayness of life, as a mirror of the essential oneness of mankind throughout the world. And the photographs depict a whole range of supposedly universal human activities and emotions from different countries. You see work, music making, literacy, grief, religion, justice, and many more. And the exhibition, I think, is a perfect illustration of the human we I've been talking about, emphasising as it does the essential oneness of what Steichen calls mankind. So Steichen's Family of Man, I'm going to show you some illustrations in a moment, it's warmer and more tingly than Epstein's conception, I think. But it's the same basic conception, this idea at heart of a clearly identified ahistorical, transcultural human community. And I should say, these are gorgeous photographs. If you get a chance to have a look at more than the few that I'm going to show you now, I recommend it, that they are individually very beautiful photographs, most of them. But it's when they're put together, and when they're put together in a particular way that Steichen does so, that they start to become problematic. So to give you a taste, I've got the first few images from the book, which I'll take you through. So it starts off with a series of images of wholesome heterosexual lovers of all nations. I've got 4 of them here. And then moves on, of course, inevitably to marriage all around the world. Followed, of course, inevitably by pregnancy. You catch sight of one of the few non-human animals in the collection areas. And then, of course, from pregnancy, inevitably to childbirth, and so on and so on. You get the idea. Okay. So, Roland Barthes provides a critique of the Family of Man exhibition, or the Great Family of Man exhibition, as it's called by the time it hit Paris. And he describes how an ahistorical myth of human community is stressed by the exhibition, in which we all supposedly share. Differences and exoticism are first emphasised, as you can see, and then a kind of magical unity emerges from this pluralism. Man is born, works, laughs and dies everywhere in the same way. Barthes calls this the ambiguous myth of the human community, which serves as an alibi to a large part of our humanism. It exhibits an ideology of what he calls classical humanism. Here Barthes suggests beneath the relativity of human institutions, or the superficial diversity of skin colour, one quickly reaches the solid bedrock of a universal human nature. History is suppressed, and the cultural mythological concept masquerades as natural. Barthes' particular objection to the exhibition's construction is that it ignores differences. His atomism, as he calls it, suppresses the specificities of inequality within and between particular human cultures. Barthes' critique urges us to appreciate differences within the great family of man. In doing so, though, Barthes ultimately leaves intact this great family of man. He argues, as he explicitly says later in the essay, for a progressive humanism, which would restore history and difference, but ultimately to humanistic ends. And in what follows in the rest of my paper, I'm hoping to pursue a more radical critique of this great family of man. I'm going to be looking for alternative unities and also for differences that cut across the boundary or binary that supposedly separates the great family of man from everything else. So I want to suggest that we might characterise the preeminent or exclusive self-identification as human, which we find in writers like Epstein and even in Roland, as a particular form of bad faith. It's a self-deception, a semi-acknowledged, willful denial that an individual is more than this. For want of a better term, we might call it humanist bad faith. The waiter acts too much like a waiter, like an automaton or object, aware that he's more than a waiter, but at the same time deceiving himself in this. And in the same way, the humanist identifies preeminently or exclusively as human, denying that he or she is far more than this. Now, my concern with this particular humanist bad faith is not just that the writer or speaker is thinking inauthentically or self-deceptively, which is Sartre's main concern in Being Nothingness, I think. More significant is the fact that this mode of address, this invocation of the inviting we, works to interpolate the reader or the listener. When Epstein or another writer, immersed in their individual project of humanist bad faith, addresses us with an inclusive, inviting we, the text hails us, it calls to us, the readers, to recognise this human we as our own. You may remember, if you've looked at the outer, in Altadaire's elaboration of the notion of auto-interpolation, the police officer, he says, hey, you there, and all the usual suspects who hear this, they wheel around, taking this call to be directed at them. And so it is in these texts that we're called to us as human beings with a we. We're hailed, I think, as members of the family of man. So there are, of course, many other forms of self-identification, other we's we might wish to claim allegiance to. And I'll be suggesting 3 examples in a little while. In the next section, though, what I'd like to do is make use of Nietzsche, the birthday boy, to help us to address some of the problems with this particular form of interpolating humanist bad faith. I want to make use of a particular idea or theme of this that runs throughout his works, and the idea is this imperative to become what you are, which he takes from the ancient Greek poet Pindar, and which I think can provide a very productive approach to the question of self-identification. Nietzsche takes up Pindar's phrase and returns to it throughout his work, but the most fully worked through account of the phrase occurs in Nietzsche's last work, Ecce Homo, in which it's in fact used as a subheading to the work as a whole. Wie man wird, was man ist, how one becomes what one is. Indeed, in many ways, I suggest it's the key to understanding what Nietzsche's up to in this rather unconventional autobiography. So Ecce Homo was written in 1888, and Nietzsche completed the foreword ready for the book's publication on his 44th birthday. He was, however, on the point of teetering on the edge of insanity at this point. In Ecce Homo, he sets out to provide an account of how he became what he is, a sort of retrospective of his life up to this point. And there are 2 key components, I think, to this process for Nietzsche. In the early part of the work, he provides an account of his own character and disposition, concentrating particularly on his character traits and instincts and on his practical choices in life. And these are the notorious sections, if you've come across this work before, with titles like Why I Am So Wise, Why I'm So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books. And there's certainly a good deal of grandiosity and posturing in Ecce Homo. You can't deny that. But in fact, many of these sections, many of these passages, the large part of them deal with very practical matters, such as making sure that you live in the right kind of place or climate that's right for you, making sure that you eat the right food, make sure you engage in the right recreational reading and so on. They're all about attending to your personal physiology and acting accordingly. And then also Nietzsche explains that he's become what he is principally by means of writing his books. Most of Ecce Homo is comprised of short accounts of each of his works and how the themes and concerns with which they deal relate to particular periods in his life. So Ecce Homo traces the development not just of Nietzsche's life or of his philosophy, but of the interconnection between the 2. And he explicitly explains what he means by the phrase, become what you are, in the 9th section of the section titled Why I Am So Clever. Now, so often with Nietzsche, this is a very rich and often cryptic section. It makes a lot of points in a very short space of time. But it divides without too much violence to its subtleties into 3 successive points that he makes, on which I've characterised under 3 imperatives. So I'm going to move through each of those now. So the first imperative, to start with, Nietzsche says, do not seek to understand yourself too quickly. This will cause you, he says, to misunderstand, to belittle, and to narrow yourself, to make yourself mediocre. And there are various aspects to this point. Becoming what you are presupposes, in the first instance, that you have no idea what you are. You might make what seem like mistakes and take wrong turnings, he says, but you cannot know in advance that these will not, in the future, turn out to be valuable or even clever moves. Becoming what you are is not the same as the injunction to know thyself. Attempting to do so, Nietzsche says, leads only to decline, to self-forgetfulness, to self-misunderstanding and narrowing. Trying to know yourself too soon limits you. And then Nietzsche says you should be very wary of Greek words, attitudes and imperatives. These 2 pose the threat that you will understand yourself, which is to say misunderstand yourself too quickly. So the key point then about not knowing yourself too soon is permitting yourself to become what you are, which is as yet unknown. So Nietzsche's second imperative, or what I'm characterising as his second imperative, he says, don't suppress any of your different qualities and capacities. If you're going to allow yourself to become what you are, all your disparate qualities and faculties should not be allowed to disturb one another. All the different aspects of your character should be allowed to flourish, or at least be acknowledged. Contradictory qualities and virtues should be let be. Crucially, there must be no destroying or reconciling these diverse qualities that make up yourself. He suggests we must practice the art of separating without antagonising and permit a tremendous multiplicity which is nonetheless the opposite of chaos. And then to his third imperative, do not strive for anything, he says, or wish anything to be other than itself, or wish yourself to be other than you are. I have harboured no desire, Nietzsche says, and I have not sought honours, money, or women. Not that I could not have had them, he adds. The crux of his thinking here is anti-teleological. It's important, Nietzsche says, not to set yourself goals. Rather, you should simply let things come to fruition. If you've got the courage and the singleness of purpose to allow your capacities and qualities and faculties to flourish, you will not need to set yourself external goals. Nietzsche himself, he observes, modestly, just happened to find himself one day first a professional philologist, and then at an unfeasibly early age professor. Everything came easily, he says, without any struggling or striving. So says Nietzsche, there's no ripple of longing as I look out over the calm sea of my immense future. Okay, so I characterised this passage from Ecce Homo in terms of these three imperatives, and to be even more schematic, I want to just recharacterise it slightly in terms of the three key terms in the phrase becoming what you are. So I'll move through these briefly. So first of all, he urges us, or urges you, the reader of Ecce Homo, to become what you are. And I've recounted Nietzsche's discussion according to these three negative imperatives, three prohibitions, thou shalt not. And these perhaps emphasise the passive or prescriptive aspects to his thinking here, which are undoubtedly there. This is by no means all that Nietzsche is concerned with. He's also all about actively embracing and enhancing and cultivating that which you are. In Gay Science, an earlier text, where he returns to this theme, he specifically says, we want to become who we are, human beings who are new, unique, incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. And it was in a very active process of writing his books, of course, that Nietzsche became what he was. Nietzsche is all about cultivating and creating a self, but this self-creation is not about creation ex nihilo, it's about forging a self from what you have. You must be proactive about this, but you must also acknowledge what you're working with. So you should actively, creatively become what you are. Secondly, Nietzsche urges that you become what you are. The subtitle of Ecce Homo is Wie man wird, was man ist, how one becomes what one is. It's not der man is, who one is, although it does appear in that formulation elsewhere in his work. And there are at least two things that Nietzsche has in mind, I think, here, when he says that one must become what rather than who one is. As I mentioned, he's very keen on the early sections of Ecce Homo, on accepting your own physiology and corporeality. We should be aware of the specific capacities and requirements of our physical bodies and work with these. So early in Why I Am So Clever, for instance, he discusses how alcohol disagrees with him, although of course he can drink like a sailor, how he opposes eating vegetarian food, how a large meal is actually easier to digest than a small one, how he avoids snacks and coffee, preferring a strong tea, and so on. And he talks too of how climate speeds up or slows down metabolism, how it's important to seek out places with dry air, Paris or Provence or Athens, for instance. Inappropriate diet or climate, Nietzsche suggests, will affect you profoundly, including your own thoughts and ideas. Secondly, his understanding here resonates with what he takes from Pindar. Pindar's understanding of becoming what you are is a non-internalist conception. He means to put into effect or to realise yourself through your actions. There's no inner essence that Pindar's suggesting needs to be fulfilled. It's all about action and doing rather than navel-gazing. And similarly, Nietzsche has no interest here in an internal or personal essence, a deep who that we must learn to find. We must forge ourselves from out of the materials that we have. And we must not deny the past history of our actions and behaviour, side paths and wrong turnings, the effort squandered on seemingly marginal tasks. The what is realised through your actions and behaviour. So we might say that we should act what rather than learn who we are. So you should become, embody in action, what you are. And then finally, Nietzsche urges that you become what you are. There are different formulations again of the phrase in Nietzsche's work, but however he formulates it, there's no getting away from the fact that there's an undeniable, unrelenting individualism to Nietzsche's approach here. His advice or suggestions or imperatives here are all about becoming who or what you are. You must know yourself, you must not know yourself too soon, you must not reconcile your personal capacities must not strive to be different from what you are. Rather, you must actively cultivate yourself and recognize your corporeal idiosyncrasies and actions. And in fact, this whole ninth section of Why I Am So Clever is elaborated by means of addressing the importance of selfishness. Nietzsche will concede absolutely nothing to social or cultural context, and certainly nothing to Catholic Christian notions of selflessness. Of supreme overriding importance is the cultivation of the you, the one, the individual. So you should become the single individual one that you are. Now, Nietzsche's approach to the question of becoming what you are is certainly not to everyone's taste. I quite like it. I think there's much to admire here as a personal philosophy, as a means of approaching or coping with life. But I want to suggest that we can put his notion of becoming what you are to work to further a more expansive project than the individualism to which it immediately lends itself. And I think we can use it to help us with the problem of reconfiguring human-animal binary, with the problem of humans' bad faith, with the problem of interpretative, anthroponormative self-identification. In an interview from the 1970s, when asked about his own use of Nietzsche's work, Foucault said, "For myself, I prefer to utilize the writers I like. The only valid tribute to thought such as Nietzsche's is precisely to use it, to deform it, to make it groan and protest." Incidentally, today's actually Foucault's birthday. He would have been 85 today. So in the next section, I'll be putting Nietzsche's work, Nietzsche's thought to work, and perhaps you'll have to judge making it groan and protest. I want to take up two of the components of his approach to becoming what we are, the becoming and the what, and to subvert somewhat the singular you, the third part. I'm hoping that we can turn this you into a we, or better, into lots of we's. So I'd like in the next section to outline, far too briefly, tentatively, three alternative, other than human collectivities to which we belong, as I mentioned earlier. So this is my third part. So I want to think about other forms of self-identification as alternatives to the humanist bad faith that I outlined. And to provide these alternatives, these three alternatives, under the headings lineages, colours, and cunnilingus, which in fact cross over the species boundaries, the human-animal binary, altogether. And I'm not suggesting for a second that these exhaust the possibilities of other commonalities, other we's that we could find, but these ones struck me as important or interesting or good starting point. So the first alternative to the great words and imperatives of the great family of man, I want to consider alternative familial collectivities. Most of us, of course, consider ourselves as belonging to familial collectivities that are considerably less extensive than the huge family of man. I can think of myself as a we with my immediate family, a nuclear or single parent family, an extended family, however we conceive that, and so on. But I'd like to think initially, for my first example of non-human collectivities, about broader or wider or larger familial collectivities that go beyond the human we. So, Orson Welles and Hunter S. Thompson, unlikely, both articulate an oft-heard and rather pessimistic characterization of life. Orson Welles once said, "We're born alone, we live alone, and we die alone. Only through our love and friendship can we create the illusion for the moment that we're not alone." And then Hunter S. Thompson, very similar sentiment. "We're all alone, born alone, die alone, and in spite of the true romance magazines, we should all someday look back on our lives and see that in spite of our company, we were alone the whole way." Now, contrary to this rather bleak cliche, I think it's one of the very few constants regarding individual creatures' birth or creation that we're not born alone. You're never alone on your birthday. Every living thing had parents, or more properly, every living thing sprang forth from parental genetic information. In familial terms, the first necessary we is that constituted by an individual and his parent or parents. This is true irrespective of the mechanism of reproduction and applies even to bacteria who reproduce by cellular division. After this most basic of familial we's, the parent-offspring we can extend the familial collectivity by adding siblings, adding progeny, adding grandparents and so on to construct a more or less inclusive family tree as we wish. Now we appreciate that family trees of this sort that we construct represent actual individuals, me, my daughter, my parents, my grandparents and so on. And then we tend to think, I think, of evolutionary phylogenetic trees on the same model. We imagine the component species of phylogenetic trees as distinct entities descending one from another. You can see something like this in the illustration which I've taken from Heidel here. But we need not think of an evolutionary tree, a tree of life, as modelled on family trees. In principle, these two are one and the same. Given a large enough piece of paper, you could in principle extend your family tree backward and it would eventually become an evolutionary tree. Your immediate ancestors we would call human, of course, parents and grandparents and so on, but as you go further back, this is not the case. So following an unbroken line of parental relationships, we can continue backwards or upward indefinitely along a family tree's lineage, pausing at any point. You can think of a small familial lead starting with just you and your parents, or you can think a little more inclusively and add grandparents, great-grandparents and so on. But as we go further back along the generations, it becomes more convenient to divide up this lineage, not in terms of an increasingly inclusive family, but in terms of taxonomic ranks. Instead of pausing at the level of grandparents, we can pause at the level of species and think, as we saw earlier, of a we that comprises the great family of man. Or we can pause at the level of genus, such that the individual on whom you pause is an ancestor, not just of your immediate family, but of all the many species of Homo, not just Homo sapiens, but Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, and so on. At the taxonomic rank of genus too then, we could also say we humans. I'm not entirely clear whether these would be included in the great family of man. Or if you go a little further, you can pause at the taxonomic rank of family and say we great apes, or a good deal further back, you can reach the rank of kingdom and say we animals. Traditionally, there are 8 basic taxonomic ranks, and we each belong to all of these many we's. Note that these ranks are an historical taxonomic convention. They're fantastically useful to be sure, but the traditional 8 major ranks are somewhat arbitrary conventions. In principle, we can stop off at any point along the lineage. Following your family line back, pausing at particular individuals, there are no clearly demarcated ranks that reflect clear divisions in the lineage. Rather, it's just generation after generation of parent-child relationships, with each child slightly different from the parent. Diachronically, there are no sharp breaks between individuals, and it's not possible to identify the exact point at which, following the lineage back, we move from, for instance, the order of primates into the broader class of mammals. So, in addition to the human we can choose to claim an allegiance, to isolate a we, to identify a collectivity according to various ranks and according to various points along our lineage. Okay, so we can complicate the question of familial collectivities. I'd like now to think a little bit about perceptual collectivities. Humans are traditionally thought to possess the familiar 5 senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. There are other faculties that are usually classified as senses in the scientific literature, however: thermoception, the sense of heat, nociception, the sense of pain, and others. And there are other senses that humans do not ordinarily possess: echolocation, possessed by bats and dolphins, for instance, or electroception, the ability to detect electric fields, possessed by many fish and sharks. So I think we could certainly conceive collectivities which would cross species and cross the human-animal binary based on particular perceptual capacities. We who see, we who hear, we who are sensitive to pain, and so on. We could reconfigure the human-animal binary along perceptual axes. But we should complicate this further, of course, by starting not from the species, but with Nietzsche, from the individual. We should remember, that is, that not every member of a given species, including humans, will possess all the senses possessed by other members. Not all humans can see or hear or experience pain. And further, there are some rare human individuals who possess additional senses. Some humans have developed a form of echolocation, for instance. So any collectivity that we conceive based on perceptual faculties will certainly cross species, and it will do so unevenly, depending on the individuals in question. Even so, characterising collectivities in terms of having a sense or not is still a rather crude characterisation. Of course, there are significant differences in terms of power or range or extent of an individual's or a species' different perceptions. So I'd like to complicate things a little bit further. I'd like to focus, just as an example, on sight, in particular on colour vision, a fascinating and still relatively under-researched area of colour vision. Human retinas have three kinds of cone cell, the photoreceptors sensitive to colour. Humans, along with other primates and some other mammals, are thus trichromats, combining the sensitivity to different wavelengths of these different kinds of cone permits trichromats to perceive a massive range of colours. Dichromats, such as dogs and many other mammals, who have two kinds of cone cell, see far fewer colours, and monochromats cannot detect colour at all. On the other hand, many birds and insects can detect additional wavelengths of light. Birds have four kinds of cone, they're tetrachromats, and can perceive ultraviolet wavelengths that are undetectable to humans. So these two images of the same flowers, one's a standard on the left. On the right, a camera that's sensitive just to ultraviolet light is taking an image of the same flowers and reveals patterns that humans ordinarily can't detect. So we could conceive a perceptual collectivity based on colour vision, which would distinguish us trichromats, humans and howler monkeys, both from dichromats, dogs and donkeys, and tetrachromats, turkeys and terns. But again, I'd like to complicate this a little bit further. We can construe collectivities based on whether a species or an individual is a dichromat or trichromat, but we could also think in terms of collectivities based on whether a species or individual can distinguish between particular colours. As dichromats, dogs cannot distinguish shades of red. It thus be excluded from the trichromatic collectivity that brings together those who can distinguish the colours of a red London bus from a green English lawn. But like those trichromats, they can distinguish, for instance, between blue and green. They can see the difference between a clear blue summer sky and the green of that English lawn beneath. Or more broadly still, if we want to conceive the broadest possible collectivity based on colour vision, we can include all creatures with some degree of colour perception. The collectivity here would be we perceive colour. The only creatures that would be omitted from this collectivity would be monochromats. Now I'd like to complicate this question, just the perceptual collectivity is just one stage further. It was long thought that human babies, an example at the back is just escaping, had no colour vision at all. When it was thought that when human babies were born, they could only see in black and white, or sort of saw no colour anyway. This turns out to be untrue. Although it's not very well developed, human babies do have some degree of colour vision when they're first born. But as the months go on, their colour vision significantly improves. So their colour vision changes over time. And similarly, we should also remember that not all human individuals have the same capacity to distinguish colours. Approximately 8% of men and 0.5% of women have some form of so-called colour blindness, or are unable to distinguish some combination of colours. On the other hand, there's the possibility, which is as yet unverified, but suspected, that certain human individuals are actually tetrachromats with four kinds of colour and the capacity to detect an even greater range of colours. So to conclude, we can conceive of different scales of perceptual collectivity based on how much colour we're interested in. We can say we trichromats as opposed to the dichromats or tetrachromats, and this collectivity already crosses species boundaries, including the human-animal binary. We can also say we can distinguish different pairs of colours, for instance blue and green, which would include some dichromats within our collectivity. Or we could say more expansively, we have some capacity for colour discrimination. And when we consider all these perceptual collectivities, just remember that some human individuals will be included and some excluded, and also that any given individual will be part of such a perceptual collectivity at one time, perhaps not as another, as the changing colour perception of human infants demonstrates. Okay, so I've suggested we can look at the question of familial collectivities and the question of perceptual collectivities. For my third and final example, I want to think about behavioural collectivities. There are, of course, many forms of behaviour in which humans and members of other species engage. I'd like to focus on sex, and in particular, I'll focus on oral sex. Members of many different species engage in oral sex. You might well have seen documentaries about the sex-obsessed bonobos, but you'll also find deer, whales, walruses, sheep, lions, cheetahs, bears, hyenas, kangaroos, and many others engaging in oral sex. For the sake of brevity, I want to focus mostly on cunnilingus oral sex, in which, as it's ordinarily conceived, one partner uses their mouth, lips, or tongue to stimulate their partner's clitoris, vulva, or vagina. And I want to look briefly at two particular species who engage in this form of oral sex. The two examples, I should say, with illustrations, come from Bruce Baggenhall's fascinating book, Biological Exuberance, which looks at 300 or so species who exhibit what he calls homosexual, bisexual, or non-reproductive or alternative heterosexual behaviours. So, first of all, I want to just quickly look at these long-eared hedgehogs who engage in varied affectionate and sexual practices, including rubbing, cuddling, and sliding, which you can see at the top here. Both heterosexual and lesbian pairs engage in cunnilingus. You can see two females doing it at the bottom here, involved in extensive licking, sniffing, and nibbling of each other's genitals. And as you can see, despite the jokes, hedgehogs certainly have no problems managing to have sex. So, there's my hedgehogs. I've also got some dolphins for you. Bottlenose and spinner dolphins engage in a huge variety of different sexual activities, heterosexual, bisexual, and homosexual. And this certainly includes a good deal of clitoral stimulation by means of snout, flickers, and even tails. In fact, because both males and females have a genital slit, both can be penetrated by a beak and stimulated genitally. Now, technically, this would not be cunnilingus if performed on a male dolphin, but the activity is the same when performed on or by both males and females. But there are two particular forms of oral sex that I wanted to mention, which are distinctive of dolphins. One is genital buzz, a form of acoustic foreplay. I mentioned a moment ago that dolphins make use of echolocation. With acoustic foreplay, one partner stimulates the other by directing a stream of low-pitched, rapid buzzing clicks at the partner's genital area. And the other form of oral sex that I want to mention in regard to dolphins is genital beak propulsion, which is what you can see here, in which one partner inserts their beak into their partner's genitals and gently propels them both forward. So we can think of collectivities based on sexual behaviour. In this case, we who engage in oral sex, or we who engage in cunnilingus. And once again, this collectivity crosses species boundaries, including the human-animal binary. And I want to make two brief points about this particular behavioural collectivity. First, I was keen to focus on oral sex in order to offset the rather heteronormative focus of the great family of man, and perhaps my own focus on reproduction, with which I began to complicate that great family of man. Reproduction is important, vital even in the literal sense, for some familial collectivities, but the activity of sex is not necessarily about reproduction. As Baggenhall argues in Biological Exuberance, reproduction is only one of the principal biological functions of sexual behaviour, others including group cohesion and lessening of tensions. It's important, I think, that in thinking about our physiological capacities and behaviours, as Nietzsche has effectively recommended we do, to avoid over-hasty biological reductionism. And the other point I want to make, which is perhaps an obvious one, regarding this particular collectivity, is that, of course, it's based on a behaviour that is individual and intermittent. Not every individual, whether human or hedgehog or dolphin, engages in cunnilingus. And of course, even those who do, don't do it all the time. As with the examples of perceptual collectivities based on colour discrimination, it's important to start with the individual, and we should not talk in terms of entire species. It does not make sense to say that humans or bats or dolphins engage in cunnilingus. Some individuals do this, and are part of this collectivity sometimes. In reconfiguring the human-animal binary, it's important, at least if we're to benefit from Nietzsche's perspective, to pursue this reconfiguration not just at a species level, but also at the level of individuals. So these have been my three tentative, alternative ways of thinking about collectivities. I've focused on familial collectivities, by looking not on the great family of man, but at other taxonomic ranks or lineages to which we belong. I've looked at perceptual collectivities, for instance, those we might construct based on the facility to share, we share to discriminate colour. And I've looked at a behavioural collectivity, specifically the sporadic individual activity of engaging in oral sex. There are, of course, many more kinds of collectivity we might consider under these three broad headings and others. And this brings me to my second request. As I said, this is a new project I'm just starting to work on. I'm interested in new, interesting, non-human collectivities that some or all of us might be conceived as belonging to. So if you have any great ideas that I can rip off and add into my research, please do let me know. Okay, so by way of brief conclusion then, I think that the identities with which you align yourself depend, of course, on your values and objectives, on your perspective in Nietzschean terms. And if your objective is to affirm and uphold human supremacy and privilege, as it is for Epstein certainly, then it only makes sense to focus on a single human identity. But this is an impoverished identity, I think, a form of humanist bad faith. It's politically and ethically and personally suspect. If your values are otherwise, I'd argue that it's important not to allow yourself to be interpolated by a discourse of humanist bad faith. It's important, when reading a we that unnecessarily or unwittingly assumes a human we, to notice this fact, and where appropriate to resist it, to refuse it, to reject the interpretation as human. It's important to affirm other additional identities too, a wider family, a shared perception, even a sexual commonality. We owe it to ourselves, each of us, and to the other members of the multiple collectivities to which we belong, to become what we are. Thank you.